Thank you very much. Thank you all. Welcome at this event at the COP in Bellum. I'm present in Bellum now at the COP. There's a lot going on here, but today we are going to listen to a specific presentation on the consumption of energy in buildings and why this is important, and why I would say the focus on buildings should be much more intense than actually what we've seen at the moment at the COP. We see that there has been a lot of innovation made in new construction materials, and actually new buildings can achieve significant energy savings and high levels of energy efficiency. But what we also see is that, I'm from the Council of Europe Development Bank. We specifically focus on social projects in Europe, which also means social buildings. But what we see is that only a small percentage of buildings are actually new buildings. Most of the challenges that we encounter in Europe and actually also elsewhere in the world is that most of the savings, most of the CO2 reductions need to be achieved in existing buildings. And we can only meet zero carbon levels half this century if we really focus on the existing building stock. And this is a social dimension as well, because we're talking about existing houses, we're talking about people living there, we're talking about quite a difference in quality of housing, and this is also why this is an important topic for the CEB, basically focusing very much on vulnerable groups. Just a little bit more before I start to introduce the speaker. We are a multilateral development bank established in 1956. We are founded very much focusing on housing for refugees, and later other topics also related to vulnerable groups and also environmental protection became important too. But before, just to make it not too long, let me pass now the floor to my colleague Horst Wattenbach, and he is from our evaluation department, and he will discuss the topic further with you. So thank you very much, and have a good session today.
Thank you very much, Carol. Greetings from the CEB premises in Paris. It's a pleasure to share with you some findings derived from evaluating public support programs for thermal rehabilitation of buildings. That there were two challenges that in combination led to preparing this presentation. Oops. The obvious first reason was the importance of the building sector as emitter of greenhouse gases and the sluggish improvement in the sector. Now, as Carol has mentioned, new materials and construction methods allow building to much higher energy performance classes, making even zero emissions buildings reachable, which are the sectoral targets for 2050, as was just mentioned. But new constructions only add annually a minor share to the existing stock, and therefore the most important challenge for reducing greenhouse gas emissions lie in the existing housing stock. Now, the second challenge and a major concern for the CEB is the social dimension. On the left side, we illustrated the increase in household gas prices in selected European countries, which put pressure on poor households to meet energy needs. And on the right side, we see a map of Europe and the prevalence of energy poverty. The darker the color, the higher the percentage of population which is unable to keep their houses adequately warm. Now, as a side remark, for countries in the south, an equivalent map could be drawn up representing the poverty dimension of heat stress in buildings equivalently. The connector between the two is shown in this figure. It shows the distribution of energy performance across some European countries, whereby dark red presents buildings with low energy performance, class E, and the worst existing category F. Orange represents buildings with energy performance classified as C on the European system, and this level is often the aspiration of support programs after rehabilitation. At the other extreme, at bottom, we see in green the energy class A and a small percentage of existing buildings. Please note that this is still not yet the level that corresponds to a zero emissions building. That is a small subset of the green category here. Now, the last slide to set the scene illustrates that beyond the greenhouse gas emissions, Social Development Goal 13, and energy poverty, Social Development Goal 7, thermal rehabilitations also contribute directly and indirectly to 4 other social development goals. It is, in my view, also of interest to which extent public support not only finances towards these, did not only finance towards these SDGs, lending volumes, but actually contributes to making actual progress in reaching those goals, which is not quite the same thing. In addition to secondary studies, we evaluated in the field the results of lending towards public support programs in Poland and in Hungary, 2 of our member countries. We can't present details of the programs as such, just briefly. Poland has a very long-standing program of public funding that provides subsidies of 20 to 25% over time to rehabilitation investments. Now, we as a CB provided lending through a bank to offer soft financing for the owner's contributions to these investment costs. And this allowed us to look into the rehabilitation results affecting that program. In the second example, Bulgaria, after an earlier slow uptake of lending offers for rehabilitation, a large public grants program was launched that provided financing to housing rehabilitations for multi-apartment buildings. And we will look into findings from these 2 evaluations in detail. Now, if you look at the first level of results, this slide shows or gives a visual impression of buildings before and after rehabilitations. We found it from surveys and interviews with beneficiaries that, well, not surprisingly, residents express satisfaction by the increased comfort, safety standards, and noticeably value increase of their properties. At the same time, at the program level, it also is reported that it improved public trust in the recognition of publicly managed rehabilitation works. The crucial question here is, does this constitute sufficient evidence that the program should be replicated or upscaled? Now, you won't be surprised that I say maybe not quite, and let us see why. As part of the series of evaluation questions, those relevant for this presentation are the ones as follows. Has a reduction in energy expenditure afterwards kept up with expectations at design? To what extent were rehabilitation decisions financially dependent on the subsidy element? What was the public expenditure per ton of CO2 emissions reduction? And did the subsidy elements contain social components? Actually, answering the last question, it was very easy, since program designs was focused on delivering numbers of buildings. The eligibility criteria did not contain social elements. So the answer to that one was no. As an ex post evaluation focus, the other responses depended on engagement with public bodies and, most importantly, housing administration and residents. Let me share some of the findings to discuss further. Now, we are presenting illustrations from a sample of buildings which we have anonymized for confidentiality reasons. On the left side, You see the analysis of comparing ex post expectations on energy savings compared to findings in the field. We found one building, the last one on the list here, which was fully meeting expectations some years after rehabilitation. But in most cases, we more note that real energy savings fall between 1/3 and 50% short of theoretical calculations provided by the energy auditors. Now, the ones with no A mean they had no energy audit prior to works. On the right side, we see relative investment costs relative to energy savings. There's a huge variation in this amount. This is partly explained by the complexity and diversity of the types of buildings. But from an environmental perspective, this still raises questions as to a deeper analysis on the reasons if one would only look at purely energy-related public support. On this slide, you see on the left side a picture looking at the expected 25 years lifespan of rehabilitation work. Again, we see in the middle the realized energy savings, and then calculating it over 25 years and comparing it with the costs of energy savings. Now, the range again is extremely large, again driven by the different types of buildings and the share of renovation costs strictly focused on energy rehabilitations and not general work. The most important slide or finding is the one on the right side in terms of a climate policy perspective. We look at the investment costs per ton of avoided CO2 emissions and monetary savings per avoided ton of CO2. An important factor to consider here is that the energy provision of the rehabilitated buildings is diverse. We have about half the buildings which were using extremely polluting coal as energy source, but some are using less polluting gas, and some even draw in part on renewable energy, so that the saving in cost for reduced energy consumption does not translate into saving CO2 emissions. For residents and building administrators, emissions or energy savings were one of several drivers for rehabilitation. You recall the picture, how the buildings looked before rehabilitation. But from a climate policy perspective, the energy source could play also a more important role in subsidy decisions. Now on this slide, we specifically present some findings from the case of Bulgaria. This slide shows on the right side what were the energy levels after renovation works. And we can see that all programs were meeting the policy objective of achieving an energy performance of at least C. A very small number went one step higher than that. On the left side, we see how much the energy performance improved from before works to after works. And there we see that there's about 10% of buildings which, despite the renovation works, improved the energy performance by a mere one step. You can also see that in the percentage energy savings, which is correlated to that finding. So this case illustrates particularly well the concern with the efficiency of generating climate benefits through public funds. We do have buildings with very modest improvements in energy performance, and they stand next to substantial improvements in other buildings. But both draw to the same amount of grant-financed public expenditure. The overall program rehabilitated 2,064 such large buildings at a public cost of 1 billion euros, while 45,000 others still wait to be modernized. But on a positive note, a more recent program operates with a modern on-bill scheme whereby residents can generate own resources for contribution to the funding, and they might benefit from reduced public mistrust against rehabilitation works that existed prior to the existing scheme. Now, what level of evidence are we talking about in brief? The first level, obtaining evidence of outputs of support programs, is readily achieved through very simple reporting on fund use. At a results level, ex post work can provide partial answers to the initial question and can well illustrate the challenges to targeting of funds. However, the ex post assessment by itself can deliver partial answers, but has a limited potential to achieve the depth of evidence due to the tediousness of compiling complete data set if this has not been prepared at program design. As ex post work depends on the voluntary provisions of information from residents and them actually having the information available. This leads to a small subset of buildings completing all the data sets, and the granularity of findings cannot be reached to allow guiding future rehabilitation works and their designs. One question is, what is a cost or subsidy optimal insulation level of buildings? This is important as a minimum standard in the Bulgarian program was Class C, that is far from a zero emissions building. But once a building is rehabilitated, these buildings will at best maintain at that performance level for many years into the future, but make no further progress. Now we have in our paper that is available online distilled a long list of lessons which were grouped into 4 major themes, and I can only present here the 4 overarching themes. The first one is that public actors must be conscientious of the trade-off between speed of implementation and efficient use of public funds. Second, assessing realized energy savings enhances transparency and clarifies private versus society benefits of public funded energy efficiency investments. Third, social, behavioral, and institutional factors must be systematically considered in policies and projects aimed at reducing energy poverty and CO2 emissions. Multilateral development banks should encourage public entities to prepare for post-rehabilitation evaluations at the start of such programs and use the findings to improve future designs. In conclusion, public agencies and international lenders should use the financial advantage provided through their funding or through technical assistance grants to ensure that analysts can provide after closure nuanced evidence that allows feeding back into future specifications of thermal rehabilitation designs. If program designs permitted generating large-scale data on results, they could allow explaining which mix of rehabilitation works lead to which level of energy savings, thus feeding back into improved and more efficient renovation designs. As the group of multilateral development banks intensifies collaboration to get bigger and better in the face of the global challenges, I obviously agree that both are important, and for the building sector specifically, the better dimension will strongly benefit from deeper evidence. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Horst, and thank you very much for highlighting this very important topic of basically cost effectiveness of climate mitigation activities in Europe, but also in most other continents. There are huge challenges in investing in energy efficiency in the housing sector, and finance is limited. I invite people online if they have got any questions. Waiting for questions. Maybe I will ask one question first, Horst, if you don't mind. And that is very much related to the European context, and into what extent current legislation in Europe, for instance, the legislation on energy efficiency standards and reporting on energy efficiencies of housing, will help evaluating in advance and afterwards the quality of the project. And to what extent having a legislation in place for energy efficiency standards is essential. I can't hear you now, Horst. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, now it worked. Well, the EU here in Europe is an important standard setter in setting out expectations of what should be achieved. But of course, it doesn't really have the means to impose it. It requires translating into national legislation, and then also public and private owners of buildings to actually take action. So public support programs can provide incentives to speed up and support the willingness of private decision makers when it comes to their buildings to actually invest and to rehabilitate. Now, we will have in future also, of course, the CO2 pricing. You heard the recent discussions whether this should be initiated in the near future or in the more distant future. This is all a negotiation process. Once that kicks in, of course, that will provide a financial incentive for people to take action. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that all owners will be able to finance such investments. And that, again, becomes a social dimension and brings us back to the dimension of subsidies may be necessary for a certain group of people to really be able to make the investments. Like in case of Bulgaria, many pensioners who live on very modest incomes, they are unwilling to contribute to rehabilitation costs in their buildings. And they are simply unable to do so. So there's a social dimension to how much subsidy is actually really needed to help people to make the effort. My argument was more that flat rate subsidies may pose a problem to people really being able to scale up programs if many people benefit from subsidies without needing them, actually.
Thank you, Horst. I'm also reading now. We got questions from in the chat. I will also read them out just for people that are not having access to the chat. One of the questions is, let me read it out from HA. You mentioned the amount of energy savings compared to planned savings in your presentation. But winters are sometimes mild and sometimes very cold. How can you establish the real savings through rehabilitations?
Very interesting question, a little bit technical, but happy to answer it. Of course, if one were to just take the raw data from one year to the next, the validity of these data for our message would be affected by the different winter temperatures. There's a factor called degree day assessment, or a correction factor, that goes into the calculations to really correspond to a normalized temperature, to take out from the calculations the variation coming from different temperatures outside to get to the realized energy savings at a normalized level to allow for comparison.
Thank you. Let me read out another question. It's a question from Victor Beltran. He is asking, what role are MDBs playing in investing in new building standards? Is it enough? And also in mobilizing the private sector. So it's basically two questions one question on the role in the standards and the other in mobilization. I assume mobilization of private sector finance.
Mm-hmm. On the first one, of course, building standards will be always subject to national legislation. So it's not MDBs who can prescribe building standards. The only thing that MDBs could do is to provide incentives through their own funding to actually favor in their loan programs certain higher standards of building as an encouragement, or contribute through technical assistance to raise awareness of higher building standards. They could possibly also take pilot projects to look at, for example, greener building materials. The construction sector, as we even see in European countries, is in the majority very traditionalistic. So the incentives to use greener and more modern construction method may be overridden by commercial concerns of building promoters. And there, of course, the MDBs could play a role to set a role in supporting with priority new construction methods, low energy buildings, and maybe could even fine tune their support elements to give preference to set exemplary cases.
Thank you. And let me then come to the last question. Now, actually, there are two questions that are more or less similar. One question is by Aruniana. Are there any generalizable lessons from non-European context on legislation incentivizing investment? And the other question is from Sabine. And she's asking, to your knowledge, are similar studies undertaken by other entities in other emerging markets? Are there syntheses of those sorts of findings that can be brought forward as collective evidence? So it's very much focusing also on, I would say, the outside Europe context and lessons that we can generalize better or synthesize better.
Yeah. Well, in the non-European context, of course, the question that comes up is very often not the thermal insulation of buildings in terms of cold winters, but the more challenging question in that context is, of course, really the heat exposure and insulating buildings from extreme temperatures on the upper side. Now, I am not aware of similarly large-scale public programs, also, of course, because not the same amount of subsidy levels can be afforded by most of these countries to push certain types of programs. But the issue, in my opinion, is still comparable, that the richer populations, they will find ways to finance by their own means insulation or take mitigation measures by just installing, for example, ACs. But of course, it's not maybe not the best example, but for example, there was a reporting on BBC that there are different types of ACs with very simple adjustments in terms of specifications. They can be far more or less energy efficient to produce the same amount of comfort. In that case also, I mean, the poor population will first not have the information on these differences. And first of all, if they want to invest, they will go for the cheapest solution, which in that case will provide ease for the heat, but be extremely energy inefficient in how it is doing so. Because more efficient investments, again, will be more expensive than the cheapest option on the market. And there's a public role, and there, of course, there are different environmental economic instruments. There are command and control systems, and there are market-based instruments to incentivize. But I think these differences and the social difference between beneficiary groups should be considered in the public programs, whatever the instrument is that they deploy. Now, on case studies, I must say I'm not aware of a larger scale case study that really goes back with user data after program completion, because very often the problem is that monitoring and reporting stops at the moment of completion of works, and they do not leave the time to gather evidence after buildings being actively used for several years and really have data that take out problems like quality of works elements, bad designs that lead to lower standards at closure than expected, and also the human factor and how they use actually the buildings in the most efficient way.
Thank you, thank you, Horst, and thank you very much, because we come to the end of this very interesting presentation. There's a lot to talk about this topic. Let me thank again the organizers of this pavilion and the fact that the technology actually worked from the COP. Let me give you back. And for the people that are online, there are much more, I would say, interesting presentations from this pavilion. So please stay connected. And thanks again to everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.